The sun was slowly dipping toward the western hills, painting the open sky with soft shades of orange and gold. The cowboy rode along the dusty trail, his loyal horse moving at a steady pace. He was a man used to silence, carrying his life across the wide land of the frontier. His name was Daniel, though most people simply called him the Quiet Rider. Folks in the nearby towns respected him for his honesty and his way of stepping in when someone needed help. He never looked for trouble, but trouble often found him. That evening, he had no plan other than reaching the next small settlement before nightfall. The trail bent along a patch of forest where a lake shimmered in the last light. The cowboy pulled on the reins, giving his horse a chance to drink. He liked this place. It was quiet, almost untouched, a pocket of peace in a rough world. As the horse lowered its head toward the water, Daniel heard something strange. It wasn't the sound of the wind in the trees or the cry of a bird. It was sharper, desperate, like someone calling out for help. He froze for a moment, his ears tuned to the sound. There it was again, a voice echoing over the water. This time he could make out the words. A woman's voice, trembling yet strong enough to reach him. "They stole my clothes. Cowboy, please help me." His brows furrowed, and without thinking twice, he swung himself off the saddle. His boots hit the ground with purpose, and he scanned the lakeside. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like glass, but his eyes quickly found movement. Near the rocks, partly hidden by tall grass, was a young Apache woman. She was waist-deep in the lake, her long dark hair flowing over her shoulders like a curtain. Her face was filled with distress, and her hands clutched the waterline nervously. She spotted him and called again, her voice carrying both fear and hope. "Please, they took my clothes." "I cannot come out." Daniel's heart tightened. He understood what had happened. She must have been bathing, and some drifters, always looking for mischief, had played a cruel trick. To them it was just a game. To her it was humiliation. He stepped closer to the water's edge, careful not to startle her. His voice was calm, steady, the way a man speaks when he wants to bring comfort. "Don't be afraid. I'll help you. Stay where you are." The woman's eyes searched his face. She saw no laughter there, no cruelty, only sincerity. She gave a small nod, and that was all he needed. Daniel's gaze moved to the ground, searching for signs. Years of riding the land had sharpened his skills. In the damp soil near the shore, he noticed footprints. 2 sets, careless and uneven. Whoever had taken her things had gone toward the woods, leaving a trail even a blind man could follow. He straightened and touched the brim of his hat. "Wait here. I'll be back." His horse lifted its head as if to ask what was happening, but Daniel gave no explanation. He moved quickly, following the tracks. Each step told him more about the thieves. They weren't skilled woodsmen. Their boots crushed branches. Their laughter drifted back through the trees. The cowboy slowed his breathing, becoming part of the forest. Soon he spotted them through the leaves, 2 young drifters, ragged in their clothes, sitting by a fallen log. In their hands, they tossed around a bundle of fabric, laughing as if they had found a treasure. Daniel's jaw tightened. To him, this was no harmless prank. This was cruelty against someone who had done nothing to deserve it. He stepped out from the shadows, his presence as solid as the ground beneath their feet. His hand rested on his holster, not to draw but to remind them who he was. The drifters' laughter died quickly when they saw him. "You boys have something that doesn't belong to you," Daniel said, his voice calm but carrying steel. One of them shifted nervously, the other tried to smirk. "We was just having fun," the smirker muttered. "Fun ends here," Daniel replied. "Hand it over." The silence that followed was heavy. They knew his kind, men who didn't bluff. Slowly, the bundle was pushed across the log toward him. Daniel picked it up, his eyes never leaving theirs. "Go," he said simply. The men didn't argue. They stumbled off into the trees, their bravado gone, leaving behind only the sound of snapping twigs. With the clothes secure in his hands, Daniel turned back toward the lake. He walked steadily, his boots crunching softly on the ground. When he reached the edge of the water again, the woman's eyes widened with relief. She saw the bundle and let out a breath she had been holding. Her voice was softer now, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Daniel set the bundle on a flat rock near the shore, close enough for her to reach when she was ready. "Take your time," he said. "I'll keep watch." He turned his back politely, standing tall and facing the woods. His figure, broad and silent, was like a shield between her and the world. The woman disappeared behind the rocks, and the sound of fabric rustling carried over the water. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the trees, his hands still resting loosely on his belt. He wasn't expecting the drifters to return, but if they did, they'd regret it. When she finally stepped out, fully dressed, her posture had changed. The fear was still there, but so was dignity. She held herself with quiet strength. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment no words were needed. She saw in him not just a stranger, but a protector who had treated her with respect. Daniel gave a small nod as if to say it was nothing, though in truth he knew it meant something more. He had seen too much cruelty in his life to let it pass when he could stop it. The woman lifted her chin slightly, whispering her thanks again. And in that evening, light by the lake, something unspoken passed between them. A bond formed not by words, but by an act of simple human decency. The cowboy mounted his horse once more, but his mind stayed on the moment. The cry for help, the trust in her eyes, the way the land had brought two strangers together in such a raw, unexpected way. The trail ahead was long, but he knew this story would travel with him, etched into the silence he carried. The air around the lake grew still after the cowboy's return. The woman, now dressed, stood a short distance away, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She kept looking at him as if trying to understand what kind of man he was. Few outsiders had ever helped her before. Most settlers avoided her people or treated them with suspicion. Yet this stranger had stepped in without asking for reward, without mocking her, and without shame in helping her. Daniel, the cowboy, adjusted the strap of his saddlebag and looked once more toward the forest. He had sent the drifters away, but men like that often circled back if they thought they still had the upper hand. He could not risk them returning to cause her more trouble. He walked a little closer, keeping his voice low so as not to frighten her. "They won't come back tonight," he said firmly, "but I'll make sure of it." The woman tilted her head slightly, her long dark hair still damp from the water. "You tracked them so quickly," she said softly. "How did you know where to look?" Daniel gave a half smile. "The ground tells its own story," he replied. "Every step leaves a mark. You just need to pay attention." She nodded slowly, impressed by the ease with which he spoke. For a moment she was silent, but then her voice trembled with emotion. "They laughed at me," she whispered. "They thought I was weak." The cowboy shook his head. "What they did was cruel, not strong. Strength is in protecting, not in shaming someone." Her eyes met his again, and for the first time he saw a spark of trust there. She felt safe enough to speak her name. "I am Nayeli," she said, her tone steadying. Daniel tipped his hat politely. "Nayeli," he repeated with respect as though saying it carved it into memory. "I'm Daniel." The quiet between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, the kind that builds understanding without words. Still, Daniel knew silence could not hold forever. He had to ensure the drifters didn't circle back with more mischief. He told Nayeli to wait, then followed the trail once more into the trees, moving faster now, his eyes sharp as a hawk. The prints were easy to follow. The drifters had not bothered to hide their path, thinking the night covered them. Daniel's instincts told him they would not wander far. He was right. Within half an hour he spotted the glow of a small campfire flickering through the branches. The two men sat hunched beside it, whispering to each other in bitter tones. They had been humiliated by his sudden appearance, and their pride was wounded. Daniel crouched low, watching carefully. He could hear enough to know they were debating whether to go back and cause more harm. That was all he needed to hear. He stepped from the shadows once again, this time without hesitation. The firelight caught his figure, and the men jumped to their feet. "You didn't listen," Daniel said, his voice low but clear. "You should have left this land behind you." The taller of the two tried to sound bold. "You can't tell us where to go, cowboy." Daniel's hand moved slowly to rest near his belt, though he made no move to draw. His calmness was more threatening than any weapon. "I don't need to tell you twice," he said firmly. "If I see either of you near that lake again, it won't end the same way. Do I make myself clear?" The men shifted uneasily. They knew his kind, steady, unshakable, and not afraid of them. Finally one muttered, "All right, we're going." Daniel stood there until their figures melted into the night beyond the fire. Only when he was sure they were gone did he turn back. He stamped out the fire with his boot to make sure they had no warmth to return to, then made his way silently back toward the lake. When he returned, Nayeli was still waiting by the rocks. She had gathered some wild herbs from her small pouch, pressing the leaves together nervously in her hands. When she saw him, she let out a sigh of relief. You came back, she said softly, as if she had doubted it for a moment. Daniel nodded. They won't trouble you again, he assured her. They're moving on. Nayeli's eyes softened. She stepped closer, holding out the herbs as though offering something in return. These are for healing, she explained. If you are ever hurt, boil them. They will ease the pain. Daniel accepted them carefully as though they were something precious. Thank you, he said simply. They stood together at the water's edge, the night growing darker around them. Stars began to scatter across the sky, reflected in the surface of the lake. Nayeli's voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. Most men would not have helped me. They would have laughed, or worse. Why did you stop? Daniel looked out across the water, his jaw tightening. Because no one should be left helpless when others can stand against it. I've seen too much wrong in this world to ignore it when I can do something. Her gaze lingered on him, searching his face for signs of pride or arrogance, but there was none. He spoke the truth as simply as breathing. For Nayeli, that truth carried weight. She had grown up learning to guard her heart from strangers, to be careful of promises. Yet here was a man who had asked for nothing, who had faced down cruelty with quiet strength, and who treated her as an equal. The hours passed slowly, the quiet of the lake wrapping them in calm. Finally, Nayeli spoke again. I should return to my people tomorrow. But tonight I cannot walk alone. May I stay near your fire? Daniel gave a respectful nod. Of course. I'll keep watch. They set up a small camp near the lakeside. Daniel gathered wood while Nayeli arranged the fire with practiced skill. She sat across from him, the flames lighting her face, showing both her beauty and the strength hidden in her eyes. They spoke little, but each word carried meaning. Nayeli told him about her tribe, about the gathering of herbs she had come for, and about the struggles her people faced as settlers moved deeper into the land. Daniel listened carefully, never interrupting, offering only quiet nods of understanding. At times they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space. But the silence was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but of two people who no longer needed to prove themselves. Each felt safer with the other nearby. Later that night, as Nayeli drifted into sleep beside the warmth of the fire, Daniel remained awake. His eyes scanned the dark trees, ears tuned for any sound. The drifters were gone, but the land itself was never free of danger. He kept his hand near his belt and his heart steady, knowing he carried not just his own safety but hers as well. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, Daniel finally relaxed. He turned his gaze toward Nayeli, who was waking with the soft glow of morning on her face. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from relief after fear. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe in the company of someone outside her people. Daniel rose, stamping out the last embers of the fire. Morning, he said simply. Morning, Nayeli replied, her voice lighter than the night before. She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt. Thank you for watching. I did not feel fear while you kept guard. Daniel gave a small nod. That's how it should be. Together they looked once more at the quiet lake, now glowing under the morning sun. What had begun as a moment of shame and fear had turned into something different. A bond had formed, fragile but real, between the cowboy and the Apache woman. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew this meeting would not end here. The morning sun warmed the quiet land, spreading light across the lake and the tall grasses around it. Daniel stood by his horse, checking the saddle straps, while Nayeli finished gathering her pouch of herbs. The air smelled fresh, filled with pine from the nearby forest and the cool scent of the water. It felt like a new beginning, though neither of them quite knew what the day would bring. Nayeli adjusted the pouch at her side and looked toward Daniel. I will walk back toward my people today, she said softly. It is not far, but the path is sometimes watched. Daniel tightened the strap on his saddle and straightened. Watched by who? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Men who do not like us near the settlements, she answered. Sometimes they say cruel things. Sometimes worse. Daniel listened in silence. He had heard stories like this before. Stories of distrust that grew into anger and anger that turned into violence. He knew the frontier was a place where people often judged each other too quickly. He placed one hand on his horse's neck and looked back at her. You don't have to walk alone, he said. Her dark eyes searched his face for a long moment. Trust did not come easily for her, but she remembered how he had stood by her the night before, never once treating her with anything but respect. Finally, she nodded. "If you ride, I will walk beside you." They began their journey along the narrow trail that curved away from the lake. The forest whispered with birdsong and sunlight streamed through the branches. Daniel walked his horse slowly so that Nayeli could keep pace. At first, their steps were quiet, the only sound being the crunch of dirt beneath their feet. But as the path stretched on, she began to speak. "My people live not far from here," she said. "We move when the seasons change, but this place is close to our hearts. The lake gives us water, and the forest gives us food and medicine." She held up her pouch of herbs. "This is why I came alone yesterday. The women gathered these leaves for healing, but I did not expect to meet trouble." Daniel nodded, his hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. "Trouble often comes when you least expect it," he said. "But you met it with courage. That's what matters." Nayeli looked down at the ground, a faint smile touching her lips. "I did not feel brave until you came back with my clothes. In that moment I felt small like a child. But you reminded me that I was not powerless." Her words stayed with Daniel as they walked on. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He simply did what felt right. But hearing her speak reminded him that even small actions could change how someone saw themselves. He glanced at her, noticing the way she carried herself now, shoulders straighter, steps more sure. By midday, the forest began to thin, opening into wide fields. From a distance, Daniel spotted the outlines of wooden fences and a cluster of small cabins belonging to settlers. Smoke rose from chimneys and the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Nayeli slowed her steps, her expression tightening. "That is where they sometimes wait," she murmured. Daniel followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. He had seen men gather like that before, groups with nothing better to do than harass those who looked different. He guided his horse closer to her side. "Stay near me," he said quietly. As they approached, two men leaning against the fence straightened. Their eyes fell on Nayeli first, and their faces hardened. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the other smirked. They stepped onto the path, blocking the way. "Well, look what we have here," one of them said, his voice mocking. "A stray Indian girl walking through our land." Daniel stopped his horse, his calm presence filling the space. His hand rested on the reins, but his eyes stayed sharp. "She's not alone," he said evenly. The men exchanged glances, surprised at his tone. One of them laughed nervously. "And who are you to ride with her?" Daniel tipped his hat back slightly, his gaze steady. "A man who doesn't stand by while cowards pick on women." The smile faded from their faces. They shifted, uneasy under his calm stare. Finally, one stepped aside, muttering something about not wanting trouble. The other hesitated, but when Daniel's hand brushed near his belt, he moved too. The path cleared and silence followed as Daniel led his horse forward. Nayeli walked beside him, her steps measured, her chin lifted higher than before. When they had passed out of sight of the cabins, she released a slow breath. "You did not raise your hand, and yet they moved aside," she said with wonder. Daniel shook his head. "Most men who shout the loudest are the weakest inside. They only need to see someone who won't bend." Her eyes lingered on him, filled with a quiet respect. She had lived through many moments of fear, but this was the first time she had seen a man turn fear back on those who tried to cause it. She realized then that strength did not always come from force. Sometimes it came from silence and certainty. The trail led them to higher ground where the land rolled into soft hills. From the crest, Nayeli could see smoke rising far in the distance, her people's camp. A faint smile touched her lips. "That is home," she whispered. Daniel followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "I'll take you as far as the edge. After that, you should walk alone so your people do not think I follow uninvited." She studied him, recognizing the respect in his words. He understood the line between their worlds, a line that could not always be crossed. "You are wise," she said softly. "But I wish my people could see what I see, that not all settlers bring harm." They walked on in thoughtful silence. The sky began to soften into the colors of late afternoon, and the call of distant birds filled the air. Daniel's mind was quiet, but his heart carried weight. He knew this meeting was not ordinary. It was a rare moment in a land divided by mistrust. As they neared the hills that marked the edge of her people's land, Nayeli stopped. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unspoken words. "You gave me back more than my clothes," she said. "You gave me back my dignity. I will not forget that." Daniel tipped his hat, his expression calm but touched with respect. "And I will not forget your courage," he replied. They stood for a moment, the wind carrying the grass in gentle waves around them. Finally, Nayeli stepped back, her hand resting over her heart in a gesture of gratitude. "Goodbye, Daniel." He nodded once, then mounted his horse. "Goodbye, Nayeli." She walked toward the distant smoke of her people's camp, her figure small against the wide land, but her steps strong. Daniel turned his horse back toward the trail, the sun casting long shadows before him. As he rode away, he knew this encounter would stay with him, shaping the way he saw the world. And though their paths separated that day, both carried the memory of trust built in a single night by the lake, a trust that could outlast distance and silence. The trail behind Daniel was long and quiet as he rode away from the hills, but his thoughts were not empty. The memory of Nayeli's voice lingered in his mind, the way she had spoken about her people, about dignity, about trust. He had met many along his journeys, yet something about her words carried more weight than most. The open land stretched before him, but for the first time in a long while he felt that his path had been changed by more than just dust and wind. Nayeli, meanwhile, walked toward the smoke of her camp. Her heart was steady, but her mind was still on the cowboy who had stood beside her. She thought of how he had spoken not with pride but with quiet truth. She thought of the moment when he had faced the settlers at the fence and how his calm presence had scattered their cruelty, like dry leaves in the wind. It was rare for her to trust anyone outside her tribe, but in Daniel's actions she saw something different, a man who lived by honor, not by hate. As Nayeli reached the edge of her people's camp, she was greeted by the voices of children running, their laughter ringing through the air. The sight of familiar faces and the sound of her language brought warmth to her heart. Her people welcomed her back, but she did not share the full story of what had happened by the lake. She only said she had been helped, and that was enough for now. Deep inside, she kept the memory close, as though it was a flame that needed to be protected. Days passed, but the world around them did not rest. Rumors traveled through the land like restless winds. Settlers spoke of Apache groups moving closer to their fields, while the Apache whispered of settlers building fences where wild land once stretched free. The tension between the two sides grew sharper with every passing day, and small sparks often threatened to light into flame. Daniel, continuing on his own path, heard these whispers too. In towns and saloons, men muttered about keeping the land safe from those they didn't understand. He sat quietly listening, his face unreadable. But inside he thought of Nayeli. He thought of her words about being judged without reason, about being seen as less than human. Every rumor he heard reminded him that her fears had been true. One evening, as Daniel camped beneath the stars, he found himself staring at the fire, his hand absent-mindedly reaching for the herbs Nayeli had given him. They were carefully wrapped in a small cloth, safe inside his saddlebag. Holding them reminded him of her gift, of her trust. He knew he could not simply ride on and forget. Something inside told him he might need to cross paths with her again. The chance came sooner than he expected. A week later, while traveling near the same forest where he had first met her, he heard the sharp echo of angry voices. His horse shifted uneasily, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel followed the sound, his instincts guiding him. As he reached the clearing, he saw a group of settlers standing face to face with several Apache men. The air between them was thick with mistrust, every gesture edged with danger. Daniel stopped at the edge, watching. One settler shouted accusations of stolen livestock, while an Apache elder spoke back with calm defiance, denying the claims. But neither side listened. The settlers' hands gripped their rifles while the Apache men's bows were ready at their sides. It would only take one small spark for blood to be spilled, and then Daniel saw her, Nayeli. She stood behind the elder, her face tense, her eyes scanning the settlers as though searching for any sign of mercy. She had not seen Daniel yet, but the sight of her only strengthened his resolve. He urged his horse forward, breaking the line of silence with the sound of hooves on the earth. Both sides turned at once, startled by his sudden presence. Daniel lifted one hand slowly, showing he carried no weapon in it. His voice carried over the clearing, calm but steady. "No good will come from this," he said. The settlers frowned. "This is not your fight, cowboy," one of them barked. Daniel's gaze hardened. "Any fight that spills needless blood is my fight," he replied. "You've lived on this land long enough to know violence solves nothing. You accuse without proof. You stand ready to harm without knowing truth." The Apache elder looked at Daniel carefully, recognizing the respect in his words. Nayeli's eyes widened when she realized who he was. For a moment, hope flickered in her heart. She knew his voice could carry weight even here. The settlers shifted uncomfortably under Daniel's calm stare. His presence reminded them of what had happened near the lake. Word had traveled since then. Stories of how the quiet cowboy had shamed troublemakers and walked unharmed. His reputation was not one of loudness, but of a man whose silence carried authority. One of the younger settlers finally muttered, Maybe we should talk first." The tension eased slightly, though suspicion still hung heavy. Daniel remained between them, his presence like a bridge across the divide. He looked to the Apache elder, then back to the settlers. "Sit, speak, but put your weapons down," he said firmly. Slowly, with hesitation, they obeyed. The rifles lowered, the bows were set aside. The two groups sat, though their eyes still burned with distrust. But it was enough. The spark of violence had been smothered, at least for the moment. Through it all, Nayeli watched Daniel with quiet awe. Once again, he had not used force. Once again, he had turned anger into silence. In his way, he gave both sides a chance to see each other without the haze of rage. As the discussion began, Daniel stepped back slightly, keeping his watchful eye on both sides. He did not interfere with their words, but his presence alone kept the balance. Hours passed before the groups finally parted without bloodshed. The settlers left grumbling but calmer than before. The Apache men gathered their belongings, their pride intact. When the clearing was empty except for her people, Nayeli walked over to Daniel. Her voice was soft, but her eyes glowed with gratitude. "You came again," she said. Daniel gave a small shrug. Seemed the right thing to do. "You carry no flag, no tribe, no promise to either side," she said thoughtfully. "Yet you stand where no one else dares to stand. Why?" Daniel looked out over the land, his expression quiet. "Because land is wide enough for all, but hearts are small when filled with hate. Someone has to remind them there's another way." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then perhaps the spirits of this land sent you." Daniel tipped his hat, his face calm as ever, but her words stayed with him. In a place where lines were drawn so deeply, he had become something in between, not belonging to one side, yet respected by both. And as the evening light faded over the clearing, the bond between him and Nayeli grew even stronger. They walked together back toward her people's camp, their steps steady in the fading sun. Neither spoke much, but both understood something deeper now, that their paths, though different, had become tied by respect, by trust, and by the quiet strength of standing against cruelty. The sun dipped low over the horizon, throwing long shadows across the land. Daniel and Nayeli walked side by side, though silence hung between them. It was not the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who no longer needed to fill the air with words. Each carried the weight of what had just happened, the near clash between settlers and Apache, the tension that had almost turned into violence, and the relief that it had ended without bloodshed. Daniel guided his horse gently, letting it walk slowly so Nayeli could keep pace. He glanced at her from time to time. She held her head high, her steps steady, but he could see the flicker of weariness in her eyes. She was strong, but strength did not mean she felt nothing. She had watched her people nearly face harm, and she had watched him step into the storm to keep it from breaking. As they neared the edges of the Apache camp, the sound of voices grew louder. Women tended fires, children played near the shelters, and men returned from the day's work. The scent of roasted corn and wood smoke floated on the breeze. When the people saw Nayeli return with Daniel at her side, their voices quieted, replaced by watchful eyes. Daniel slowed his steps. He knew he did not belong here, not truly. He respected that this was her world, and he was only a traveler passing through. Still, Nayeli lifted her hand slightly, signaling to her people that he was a friend. The elder, the same man who had spoken in the clearing, stepped forward. His face was lined with years, his eyes sharp but calm. "This man stood between us and blood," Nayeli said clearly, so all could hear. "Without him, we might have lost peace today." The elder studied Daniel carefully, then gave a single nod. "Then he has our respect," the elder said. He placed a hand over his chest in a gesture of honor. Daniel dipped his head slightly, accepting without pride, simply as acknowledgement. The camp returned to its rhythm, though whispers moved among the people. Some looked at Daniel with curiosity, others with caution. It was not easy for old wounds to heal, But his presence was not met with hostility. That was enough. Nayeli led Daniel to the edge of the camp where a small fire was burning low. They sat across from each other, the flames lighting their faces. For a while they watched the fire in silence. Finally, Nayeli spoke. "You could have kept riding. You could have left and forgotten what you saw, but you chose to return." Daniel poked the fire gently with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "I couldn't forget," he said simply. "Not after meeting you at the lake. Not after hearing your words. I knew the anger between settlers and your people was heavy. I couldn't ride on knowing it might break into war without someone to slow it down." Her eyes softened. "Most men fight for land or for pride. You fight only to keep peace. That is rare." He gave a faint shrug. "Maybe, but it's the only fight worth standing in." The flames cracked between them and the quiet stretched again. But it was not empty, it was filled with unspoken respect. Around them, the night deepened. The stars began to scatter across the sky, bright and endless. Nayeli tilted her head back, gazing at them. "My people believe the stars are the eyes of those who came before us," she said softly. "They watch, they guide, they remind us that we are never alone." Daniel looked up too, the vastness of the night sky humbling even a man as steady as him. "If that's true," he said quietly, "then they saw what happened today, and maybe they're proud you stood strong." Nayeli smiled faintly, touched by his words. For a moment her heart felt lighter. She had carried fear for her people for so long, but sitting there with Daniel she felt hope flicker again. The night passed slowly. Daniel kept watch as he always did, his senses alert to every sound of the forest. But no trouble came. When morning broke, painting the camp in pale gold, he knew it was time to leave. His journey could not end here, though a part of him wished he could stay longer. He saddled his horse and turned to Nayeli. She stood near, her hands clasped in front of her. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "The trail is my home. I don't stay in one place long." Her eyes lowered, but then she lifted them again, steady and sure. "Then take this with you," she said, handing him a small woven bracelet of leather and beads. "It will remind you of today and of me." Daniel accepted it carefully, tying it around his wrist. "I'll carry it with honor," he said. She gave a small smile, though her eyes glistened with emotion. She did not speak aloud. "And I will remember the cowboy who gave me back my dignity at the lake, who faced anger with calm, who walked beside me without fear." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, Daniel mounted his horse. He tipped his hat to her, his eyes steady, his voice low. "Goodbye, Nayeli." "Goodbye, Daniel," she replied, her voice carrying softly across the morning air. He turned his horse toward the open land. As he rode away, the camp grew smaller behind him, but the memory of it did not fade. The bracelet on his wrist felt light, but it carried the strength of trust, respect, and the bond they had built. Daniel knew the world was still hard and unfair. He knew there would be more conflicts, more cruelty, more days when men chose pride over peace. But he also knew that one act of kindness, one stand for what was right, could change everything for someone. It had for Nayeli, and it had for him too. As the trail stretched wide before him, the wind carried the faint sound of voices from the camp, children laughing, women calling, men speaking. Life continued, but now he felt tied to it in some way. He was no longer just a rider passing through. He was part of a story that belonged to both sides. A story of a cowboy and an Apache woman whose paths had crossed at the edge of a lake. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel carried on with his wandering life. But wherever he went, he found himself telling the story of that moment, not in full, not with every detail, but enough to remind others that dignity mattered, that kindness was strength, that peace was worth protecting. The tale grew, spreading from campfires to towns until people began to whisper about the cowboy who had helped an Apache woman in her moment of need. And in her camp, Nayeli spoke too. She told her people of the cowboy who had treated her with respect, who had faced settlers without raising a hand, who had given her back hope. She spoke not to glorify him, but to remind her people that not all outsiders carried hate. In this way, their brief meeting lived on, shaping hearts and minds long after they had gone their separate ways. It became more than just a memory. It became a lesson whispered across the frontier, that even in a land divided by fences and fear, trust could be found and dignity could be restored. If only one person chose to act with honor, and so, the cowboy rode on beneath the endless sky, the bracelet on his wrist catching the sun, carrying with him the quiet strength of a woman who had once called for help at a lonely lake, and the bond that neither time nor distance could ever take away.